Hi, 5th grade. Thanks for joining me again. We're working on lesson 90 of math. You need your math book, you need something to write with, and it would be helpful if you'd looked over the lesson explanation on Jupiter. We're starting on page 467 with lesson 90, Reducing Fractions Part 2. So, as you recall, equivalent fractions are fractions that mean the same thing but use different terms. The terms of the fractions are the numerator and the denominator. When we reduce fractions, we make the terms of the fractions smaller by dividing by the same number. We divide the numerator and the denominator by a common factor in order to make the terms of the fraction smaller. So, most of the time in math, we want to make the terms of our fraction the lowest possible terms. So that means that your numerator and denominator are the smallest numbers they can be, and there's not a common factor between your numerator and your denominator other than 1. So that means if you're starting with the fraction 4/8, say you add 3/8 plus 1/8 and you get 4/8, 4/8 is the answer, and it's a totally acceptable answer. You want, though, to put your fraction into the lowest possible terms. An equivalent fraction in lower terms is 2/4, but it's still not as low as it can go, okay? Because 2 and 4 still have a common factor. In order to reduce your fraction once and to reduce it into the lowest possible terms, you want to reduce using the greatest common factor. So we found the greatest common factor between pairs of numbers before. So what you do is you look at your terms, the numerator and the denominator, and you decide what is the greatest common factor between those two numbers, and that is the number that you use to reduce. So let's practice. You can reduce in multiple steps. It's fine. It's just more work. Reducing using the greatest common factor just reduces your workload, that's all. Makes your workload smaller. So, we're starting on our practice. All right, there we go. You see my practice? Oh, my microphone's on the other side. I got to remember that. So, our practice is on page 469. We're starting with A. So, we're going to reduce some fractions. Our first fraction is 4/12. All right, the greatest common factor between 4 and 12 is 4. So 4 divided by 4 is 1. 12 divided by 4 is 3. Our fraction reduces to 1/3. B is 6/18. Okay, you can look at 6 and 18 and you know that 3 is a factor of both of those, right? But if you only reduce by 3, you're going to end up with 2/6. 2 and 6, those are not my lowest possible terms because 2 and 6, also 2 is a multiple. So, 2 is a factor. So, I probably didn't reduce by my greatest common factor the first time if I can still reduce again. So, 6 and 18, my greatest common factor is 6. So if I reduce by 6, 6 divided by 6 is 1, and 18 divided by 6 is 3, and I get 1/3. Looking at C, I have 16/24. Okay, so my greatest common factor between 16 and 24 is 8. So if I use 8 to reduce, 16 divided by 8 is 2, 24 divided by 8 is 3, and my equivalent fraction in my lowest terms is 2/3. Okay. D is asking me 4/16. My greatest common factor between 4 and 16 is 4, so I'm going to use 4 to reduce. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 16 divided by 4 is 4. My new equivalent reduced fraction is 1/4. E is 12/16. Okay, my greatest common factor between 12 and 16 is 4. So I'm going to use 4 to reduce. 12 divided by 4 is 3. 16 divided by 4 is 4. And my reduced equivalent fraction is 3/4. Now I have 60 100ths. All right, 60 100ths, the most obvious factor between these two is 10 because they both end in 0. And if a number ends in 0, it's divisible by 10. But I do have a greater common factor between the two. If I just reduced by 10, I would get 6/10. And both of those numbers are even. And I know that any even number is divisible by 2. So 6/10 would reduce to 2/5. Sorry, not 2/5, 3/5. Okay? But I can skip doing that in 2 steps. My greatest common factor between 60 and 100 is 20. 60 divided by 20 is going to be 3. 100 divided by 20 is going to be 5. Now, for our next problems, we are supposed to solve the problem and reduce the answer to the lowest terms. So this is a good habit to get into, especially because the solutions in our book for a while now, since we learned about reducing fractions the first time, but definitely from now on, the answers in our book are all reduced to the lowest possible terms. So we need to be doing that so that we know that we're getting the right answer. All right. We're starting with G, 7/16 plus 1/16. 7/16 plus 1/16 is going to give me 8/16. All right, 8/16, my greatest common factor between 8 and 16 is actually going to be 8. So 8 divided by 8 equals 1, 16 divided by 8 equals 2, and I get 1/2. For H, 3/4 times 4/5, 3/4 times 4/5. 3 times 4 is going to be 12. 4 times 5 is going to be 20. So my initial fraction is going to be 12/20. Right? I want to reduce though. So I want to know what my greatest common factor between 12 and 20 is. The greatest common factor between 12 and 20 is 4. So 12 divided by 4 is 3, 20 divided by 4 is 5, and I get the reduced fraction 3/5. I asked for 19/24 minus 1/24. Okay, that is going to give me 18/24. Okay, so that's my answer. It is correct. I just want to reduce it to the lowest possible terms. So, using the greatest common factor, 18 and 24, the greatest common factor that they share is going to be 6. All right? So, 18 divided by 6 is 3, 24 divided by 6 is 4, and I get the reduced fraction of 3/4. And my last 3 problems ask me to write the percentage as a reduced fraction. So when we have a percentage and we want to write it as a fraction, initially our fraction's denominator is going to be 100. So if we're starting with J, 25%, my first fraction is going to be 25 over 100. That is the equivalent fraction to the percentage. So now I want to reduce that. The greatest common factor between 25 and 100 is 25. So 25 divided by 25 is 1. 100 divided by 25 is 4. So I get the reduced fraction of 1/4. K is asking for 60%. The first thing I'm going to do is turn it into a fraction. My percentage becomes my numerator. My denominator becomes 100. Next, I'm going to reduce. Now, I already did reduce, back on problem F. So I know that 60 over 100 reduces to 3/5. Ta-da! And then we have 90%. So first I'm going to turn my percentage into a fraction. My percentage becomes my numerator. 100 is always my denominator. And I get 90 over 100. So the greatest common factor between 90 and 100 is 10. 90 divided by 10 is 9. 100 divided by 10 is 10. And my fraction is 9/10. Okay. So that is reducing fractions part 2, using the greatest common factor of your terms in order to put your fraction into the lowest possible terms. I hope this has been helpful, and good luck with your lesson, guys. I'll see you later.